All right, let's talk about the architect of damnation, the one figure whose name still echoes like a curse across the stars. While Horus gets all the headlines and Lorgar the philosophical credit for the fall of mankind, there's one shadowy presence who quietly lit the fuse before anyone even smelled smoke. His name is Erebus, and if you think he was just another word-bearer in red armor, think again. This wasn't some bloodthirsty berserker or glory-hungry demagogue. Erebus operated in whispers, not war cries. He didn't need legions to bring the Imperium to its knees. He just needed time, secrets, and one very specific dagger. The thing about Erebus is that his power didn't come from strength or charisma. It came from knowing exactly what to say and when to say it. He was the serpent in the garden, the lie whispered just loud enough to take root, and the first true apostle of chaos long before the galaxy even understood what chaos really was. In this story, we're not dealing with battlefield heroics or noble tragedy. This is a tale of manipulation, subversion, and one of the most insidious betrayals the galaxy has ever known. Erebus didn't just help start the Horus heresy, he made it possible. And the worst part? He did it all believing he was absolutely right. Let's peel back the layers of lies, rituals, and half-truths, and take a look at the man behind the shadow, the true architect of the galaxy's fall. Before Erebus became the dark whisper behind Horus's fall, before the dagger, before the heresy, he was already something off. He didn't need chaos to be dangerous. He was dangerous long before the ruinous powers took notice. Born on Kolkis, the same world as Lorgar, Erebus grew up soaked in religious fervor and mysticism. That planet was a boiling pot of cults, gods, prophecy, and flame, and he drank it all in. Some say that even as a child, Erebus wasn't just devout. He was obsessed, not with faith itself, but with control through faith. He wasn't trying to understand the gods. He wanted to use them. When Lorgar was reunited with the Emperor and raised up as the Primarch of the 17th Legion, the Word-Bearers, Erebus became one of his earliest and most trusted first chaplains. And here's where things get interesting. Lorgar, for all his idealism and naivete, genuinely believed in the divine. He wanted to worship the Emperor as a god. Erebus, on the other hand, didn't care about the Emperor. What he saw was power in belief itself. He saw how whole armies could be moved by ritual, how planets could fall to their knees for an idea, and he made it his personal mission to weaponize that. Erebus didn't just preach, he indoctrinated. There's a chilling duality to Erebus. He's not just a zealot, he's a tactician of the soul. He understood that belief could be more powerful than any bolter round. While the rest of the legions were busy conquering worlds, Erebus and the Word-Bearers were converting them. Whole populations turned into cathedrals of living bodies, praising the Emperor in the way Erebus taught them to. But when the Emperor shut it down, when Monarchia was destroyed, when Lorgar was rebuked, something snapped. Lorgar broke, and Erebus stepped into the vacuum. A lot of fans argue that Erebus was already a servant of chaos at this point, or at least that he had made first contact. There's this theory that his exposure to the warp predated even the Council of Nicaea, that he had been secretly communing with warp entities through Kolkisian rites long before the Imperium even had words for what he was doing. Others go further and say he was possessed, or at least guided, from the very start. But honestly, it doesn't even matter whether he was a puppet or a mastermind, because what's terrifying is that his ambition was real. Erebus saw the Emperor not as a god to be worshipped, but as a tyrant keeping the galaxy blind to its true destiny. And in that blindness, Erebus saw opportunity. The tragedy is that Lorgar still had hope, still had some kind of reverence. Erebus didn't. He had already made his choice. He was the first to kneel, not out of fear, but out of greed. And the Word-Bearers? They followed because they mistook his certainty for truth. What makes Erebus such a compelling, loathsome figure is that he didn't want glory. He didn't crave recognition or status in the way someone like Horus or Fulgrim did. His ego wasn't about spotlight. It was about results. He didn't need to be the hero. He just wanted to be the one who lit the match. In a way, Erebus is the perfect villain, not because he's loud or monstrous, but because he whispers just enough truth to be convincing. He didn't scream for chaos, he reasoned it into being. That's why he's so dangerous, because Erebus wasn't born a monster. He chose to be one, and he did it smiling. If you want to understand how the galaxy burned, you have to understand how one man broke a god's son. Lorgar was never like the other Primarchs. He wasn't built for conquest or glory. He was a philosopher, a seeker, a believer in something more. He looked at the Emperor and didn't just see a leader. He saw divinity. And that's where everything went wrong. Because when the Emperor shattered that illusion, tore down Monarchia and humiliated Lorgar in front of his own sons, it didn't just hurt him, it left a void. And Erebus was right there to fill it. Lorgar needed answers. He needed a purpose to replace the one that had just been ripped from his soul. And Erebus, ever the spiritual predator, knew exactly what to offer. He didn't push too hard at first. He asked questions, raised doubts, planted seeds. If the Emperor isn't a god, then what is he? What if there are higher powers out there, ones that want to be worshipped? Slowly, carefully, he began to guide Lorgar toward a darker understanding of the universe. It's chilling how calculated it all was. Erebus understood Lorgar better than anyone, better than the Emperor ever did. He knew that Lorgar's faith wasn't just a personality quirk, it was his foundation. And once that foundation cracked, Erebus moved in like a shadow through broken glass. He showed Lorgar the gods of the warp, not as monsters, but as the real divine forces behind the universe. Forces that had been there all along, whispering through the veil, waiting for someone to believe in them. And Lorgar, broken and betrayed, didn't just believe. He embraced them. This is the part of the story that always gets under my skin. Because Lorgar thought he was finding truth. He thought Erebus was helping him see the universe more clearly. But in reality, Erebus was molding him, reshaping his entire worldview to serve something darker. He transformed the word-bearers from a legion of preachers into a cult of fanatics. Their armor changed, their rituals deepened, their purpose twisted. They went from praising the Emperor to sacrificing worlds in the name of the Dark Pantheon, and they did it with a fervor that only true believers could muster. A lot of fans debate whether Lorgar was ever really in control after this point. Some think he always had agency, that he made the conscious decision to walk the path of chaos. But others, myself included, see Erebus's influence as far more insidious. He didn't just present Lorgar with an option. He engineered a worldview where that option was the only one that made sense. And once Lorgar was on that path, there was no turning back. What's even more disturbing is how effective this transformation was. The word-bearers didn't just fall, they descended gleefully. Erebus made faith into a weapon, and he pointed it at the heart of the Imperium. The word-bearers became missionaries of damnation, spreading belief like a virus across the stars. They didn't conquer with bolters, they converted with blood. Whole civilizations were turned into altars. And through it all, Erebus smiled. He wasn't the leader of the Legion. He didn't need to be. Lorgar wore the crown, but Erebus held the leash. And the worst part? Lorgar never seemed to notice. He believed in Erebus the same way he once believed in the Emperor. That's what makes this chapter so tragic. Lorgar wasn't corrupted by force. He was led astray by someone he trusted. And that betrayal echoes louder than any heretical chant. There's this old theory among lore fans that Erebus didn't just corrupt Lorgar. He created the Chaos Space Marines as a concept, that without Erebus, there wouldn't be a heresy. No Night Lords flaying cities, no Emperor's children chasing perfection, no Black Legion. It all starts with this soft-spoken heretic convincing one broken soul to pray to something else. That's the legacy of Erebus. He didn't need to swing a sword. He just changed one mind, and that was enough to damn millions. By the time the rest of the Imperium realized something was wrong, Erebus had already planted the seeds. Long before Istvan, before Horus fell, before even the first whispers of heresy reached Terra, he was already in motion. That's what makes this part of the story so terrifying, because the betrayal didn't begin with a battle or a speech. It began in secret, in shadows, in places no one was watching. Erebus wasn't reacting to a broken Imperium. He was planning its fall years before the galaxy ever dreamed it was possible. One of the most chilling aspects of Erebus's role in the heresy is how early he started weaving his web. While the other legions were busy winning wars, he was making alliances. But not with other Primarchs or commanders. He was speaking to things far darker. The ruinous powers had been watching humanity for a long time, waiting for a way in. And Erebus offered them that way. He didn't just stumble into chaos. He courted it. He sought it out, studied it, whispered its names when no one else dared. There are fan theories that say Erebus was in contact with the warp gods even before the Emperor set foot on Monarchia. Some even claim he was the first human to make a pact with the entities that would later be known as the Chaos Gods. Whether that's true or not, what's certain is that Erebus saw chaos not as an enemy, but as a solution, a new order, a new pantheon for a galaxy that had been robbed of meaning by the Emperor's cold atheism. He didn't want to destroy the Imperium just for revenge. He wanted to replace it, and that's how he became the bridge. He wasn't just a priest anymore. He was a messenger between realms, between gods and mortals. He began spreading the word, quietly reaching out to those who felt disillusioned, alienated, angry. It wasn't just Lorgar. Erebus began laying the groundwork for seduction across multiple fronts. Little rituals here and there. Forbidden texts passed in silence. Portents that seemed to predict disasters, but only if you had the right eyes to see them. He knew the kinds of questions to ask, the ones that made even loyal warriors hesitate. This part of Erebus's work is often overlooked, but it's maybe the most dangerous. He didn't convert with fire and blood. He converted with doubt. That was his weapon of choice. What if the Emperor lied? What if the Great Crusade wasn't about unity, but control? What if the Warp was offering freedom, not damnation? He knew exactly which strings to pull, and he pulled them with surgeon-like precision. One of the most fascinating bits of speculation among fans is that Erebus had a hand in more than just the Word-bearers and Sons of Horus. Some believe he helped influence the Night Lords, the Alpha Legion, maybe even elements of the Thousand Sons, though that's still debated. He wasn't just planting seeds in one garden, he was trying to poison the entire forest. Not everyone bit, of course, but enough did, enough to make a difference, enough to light the match. And it all started before Istvan, way before. Istvan was just the first open act. The real heresy began in temples hidden beneath cities, in dreams sent by the Warp, in the private chambers of Legion chaplains who began to preach things they never would have dared a few years earlier. Erebus made it all seem inevitable, like the heresy wasn't a rebellion, it was a revelation, a necessary correction to a false empire. He also understood the value of patience. While others rushed to battle, Erebus waited, watched, whispered. He built a network of corrupted officials, twisted psychers, and disillusioned warriors. And through them, he began to orchestrate the unthinkable. By the time the traitors struck, it was already too late. The machine was in motion, and it all goes back to Erebus, not as a general, not even as a prophet, but as an instigator. The first domino, the original heretic. Even now, some argue that without Erebus, there would have been no heresy. Horus would never have fallen, Lorgar would have remained a wounded dreamer, and the Imperium might have limped toward peace. But Erebus refused to let that happen. He saw the galaxy not as it was, but as it could be, bathed in blood, ruled by gods, and reshaped in his image. And what's worse, he believed it was the right thing to do. If you want to trace the roots of how faith became a weapon in the Imperium, you have to talk about Lectitio Divinitatis. And if you're going to talk about that book, you have to talk about Erebus. Because while Lorgar's name is etched into its pages, the truth is that much of the ideology behind it, the core infection, was whispered into his ear by Erebus. It's one of the earliest and clearest examples of how this man turned belief into a kind of slow-acting poison. Not with fire, not with sorcery, but with scripture. The Lectitio Divinitatis didn't begin as heresy. That's what makes it so dangerous. It was born from pain, from the humiliation of monarchia, from Lorgar's desperate need to reframe his worldview. The Emperor had crushed his belief, reduced him in front of the galaxy. But Erebus offered a way out. "You were right all along," he said. "You just chose the wrong god." And then he helped him write the alternative. The Lectitio became a kind of spiritual rebellion, an underground manifesto wrapped in devotion, quietly circulating even as the Emperor tried to enforce secularism. It spread like wildfire, and Erebus made sure of that. He understood better than anyone that ideas are more dangerous than swords. You can kill a man, but you can't kill a belief, especially once it takes root in desperate hearts. Erebus helped design the Lectitio to be emotionally irresistible. It told people what they wanted to hear, that the Emperor loved them, that their sacrifices meant something, that the Imperium was part of a divine plan. It promised purpose to soldiers who bled for a god who refused to call himself one. That message resonated, especially with the common folk, the mortals left behind in the wake of the Great Crusade. But behind that message, beneath the surface, was something much darker, a blueprint, not just for faith, but for control. The Lectitio was a test run, a way to see how quickly people would fall into worship when given the right story. And when they did, Erebus learned everything he needed to know. If he could get the galaxy to believe in the Emperor, he could just as easily get them to believe in something else. This is where things really start to twist. Fans often argue about when exactly the Lectitio shifted from being Emperor worship to chaos cultism, but in truth, that shift was baked in from the beginning. Erebus knew that the Emperor would reject divinity, and that rejection would breed resentment. That resentment would fester, and then, when the time was right, he would offer them new gods. Gods who wanted to be worshipped, gods who whispered back. What's even more sinister is how the Lectitio was used within the legions. There are records, buried ones, that suggest Erebus and his fellow chaplains weren't just handing this text to mortal administrators. They were pushing it on the Astartes themselves, framing it as a deeper truth. And for a legion like the Word-Bearers, already leaning toward zealotry, that was like pouring gasoline on a slow-burning fire. They began to see their own cause not just as noble, but as divine. Every battle became a crusade, every atrocity a sacrament. Erebus didn't need to lead from the front. He didn't even need to be visible. He just needed the right ideas in the right minds. And the Lectitio Divinitatis was the perfect vehicle. It gave the galaxy hope, twisted and poisoned as it was. And that hope, once it curdled, became the foundation for everything that followed. The chaos cults, the religious schisms, the burning shrines. It all starts here, with a book written in grief and molded in shadow. I've seen some fans argue that the Lectitio was Lorgar's last attempt to serve the Emperor. That maybe, in some broken part of himself, he still believed he was doing the right thing. But if that's true, then Erebus made sure that good intention died a quiet death. Because by the time the Lectitio was being quoted in rituals on demon worlds, it wasn't about the Emperor anymore. It was about faith itself, about how it could be shaped, distorted, weaponized. And that was Erebus's masterpiece. He didn't just turn Lorgar to chaos. He turned faith to chaos. He rewrote the very concept of belief into a tool of destruction. And he did it so slowly, so subtly, that most people never even realized it was happening. They still don't. Even now, the Lectitio survives, twisted into the imperial cult, hollowed out and filled with contradiction. And Erebus? He's long gone, but his words echo still, carried in the mouths of priests who have no idea who truly gave them their gospel. The events on Calth are burned into the memory of the Imperium as a betrayal beyond comprehension, but few ever ask who really made it possible. Sure, the Ultramarines remember it as the Word-Bearer's great betrayal, and rightly so. But when you dig deeper, you'll find that once again, the hand guiding everything in the shadows was Erebus. And this time, he wasn't just playing politics or spreading scripture. He was tearing into reality itself, using psychers, rituals, and forbidden knowledge to rip open the very fabric of the galaxy. The tragedy of Calth didn't begin with bolter fire or planetary bombardments. It began with a lie, a ritual hidden inside a grand military operation masked as routine redeployment. Erebus orchestrated the entire setup, placing cult operatives and corrupted psychers deep within the infrastructure of the Calth orbital stations and underground arcologies. While Roboute Guilliman and his Ultramarines believed they were supporting a trusted ally, Erebus was already preparing to turn the planet into a sacrificial altar. Here's what people forget. Erebus wasn't just a schemer, he was a practitioner. He didn't just study chaos from afar, he used it. The rituals enacted beneath Calth's surface weren't symbolic gestures. They were real, ancient rites meant to summon warp entities and unleash madness. It wasn't enough to kill Ultramarines. Erebus wanted to break them. He wanted them to see what was coming, to know they'd been betrayed on a spiritual level, not just a tactical one. And the Psychers, Emperor helped them. They were tools, fuel, and casualties all at once. Erebus had been experimenting with Psychers for years by then, not just studying them, but pushing them past their limits, bending their minds to channel warp energy in ways that no Imperial scholar would dare attempt. These weren't sanctioned librarians under controlled conditions. These were desperate souls, abducted or corrupted, used like batteries to power rituals that defied physics and sanity. Some fans say Erebus even carved warp glyphs into their flesh, binding them to demonic pacts that consumed their souls the moment the spells ignited. The results were catastrophic. The first signs were subtle: electronic malfunctions, gravity fluctuations, Vox interference, but then came the screaming, not from the humans, but from the walls. Reality on Calth began to unravel. Erebus had turned the planet into a thin membrane between real space and the warp, and once it tore, demons poured through. It wasn't just an invasion, it was a transformation. An entire world baptized in psychic fire and horror. I've read theories that Erebus never intended to win on Calth, not in the conventional sense. The Word-Bearers didn't need to conquer it. They needed it to burn, needed the bloodshed, the fear, the ritual significance. There's one particularly grim fan theory that the layout of the Word-Bearer deployments mirrored an ancient summoning circle used on Kolkis to commune with warp entities. Not just symbolic, but functional. As if Erebus had turned Calth itself into a rune of summoning on a planetary scale. And the Psyker manipulation? That was only part of it. Erebus used them like keys to unlock the gates, but he also studied the effects. Calth was a lab as much as a battlefield. He watched how the warp reacted to fear, to loyalty broken, to faith perverted. He was learning, testing the boundaries of what was possible. Every Ultramarine that died screaming, every civilian that turned on their saviors, added to his ledger of knowledge. It's horrifying, but in his twisted mind it was all research, all part of the grand design. Even the surviving Word-Bearers didn't always understand what he was doing. Some of them thought they were just enacting vengeance. But Erebus? He was already beyond vengeance. He was creating a blueprint for galactic desecration, one world at a time. And Calth was his prototype. The worst part is that it worked. Even now, the scars of that ritual still echo in the warp. Navigators avoid the system. Astropaths report nightmares just reading coordinates near Calth. Something was changed there, permanently. And all of it traces back to Erebus, smiling, calculating, utterly convinced that he was the chosen voice of something far greater than humanity. It wasn't just betrayal. It was sorcery, experimentation, and a full-blown declaration of metaphysical war. Erebus wanted the Imperium to know that its reality was not safe, that the things it called superstition were not only real, but hungry. And with every corrupted psyker, with every blood-soaked ritual, he fed them. Not for power, not even for chaos, but because he truly believed that the galaxy needed to be remade. And Calth was just the beginning. If there's one object that perfectly symbolizes Erebus, his cunning, his belief in corruption as a form of salvation, and his twisted devotion to chaos, it's the anathemy. Just the name of it gives me chills. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a ritual given form, a shard of malice sharpened by purpose, and Erebus didn't stumble upon it. He sought it out, traveled, bartered, sacrificed, and in the end, acquired the very blade that would pierce the heart of the Imperium, not by slaying a Primarch, but by twisting one. The origins of the anathemy are old, so old that even the warp seems to hum differently around it. It's not a relic from human hands, not some remnant of the dark age of technology. This thing came from deeper places. Some say it was forged in the warp itself by demons as part of a pact with mortals long lost to time. Others think it was discovered in the ruins of a dead Xeno civilization, corrupted over millennia until it pulsed with sentient hatred. Whatever the truth is, by the time Erebus got his hands on it, the anathemy had already killed more than its share of souls, and not always in the literal sense. It's not just that the blade can cut anything, it's that the wound never heals. The anathemy doesn't obey physics or biology. It obeys intention. If you strike someone with it, the blade doesn't just injure the flesh, it curses the soul. The moment Erebus realized what it was, he must have seen it as a divine gift, and he used it with the kind of precision that only someone completely divorced from empathy can manage. He didn't wield it in battle. He saved it for one perfect moment, one act of mythic betrayal. The deception began long before Horus even saw the blade. Erebus had already been working on him, softening him, twisting his dreams, using warp entities to plant doubt. But it was the wound from the anathemy, inflicted during the campaign on Davin, that sealed the deal. Horus didn't just get hurt. He was infected. His body, mind, and soul were opened up, made vulnerable, and Erebus was waiting. The wound didn't heal because it wasn't meant to. It was a key, one that unlocked the inside of the greatest general in the galaxy. This part of the story always breaks something in me, no matter how many times I come back to it. Because Horus wasn't just betrayed physically. Erebus manipulated everyone around him to make it possible. He convinced the sons of Horus to bring their wounded Primarch to the Serpent Lodge on Davin, knowing full well what the so-called healers really were. He cloaked it in necessity, in hope, in desperation. But what he was really doing was offering Horus to chaos. And the anathemy was the blood price. There are arguments among fans about whether the anathemy was truly necessary, if Horus would have fallen anyway. But I don't buy that. The anathemy made it possible. It opened the wound that chaos poured into. Without it, maybe Horus would have had time to resist. Maybe he would have died instead of falling. And that's the horror of Erebus. He didn't just corrupt Horus. He rigged the entire board to make resistance meaningless. And here's what's truly wild. The anathemy wasn't even wielded by Erebus in the final act. He gave it to another, a mortal warrior who struck the blow during what seemed like a routine skirmish. That's how deep Erebus's manipulation ran. He didn't need to deliver the strike himself. He orchestrated the circumstances so flawlessly that others did his dirty work without even knowing they were pawns. That's not just evil. That's artistry, twisted, meticulous artistry. After Horus fell into a coma and the ritual healing began, Erebus didn't gloat. He didn't stand above and cackle. He played the role of a concerned observer, kept whispering to the right people, made sure everything unfolded as planned. And when Horus awoke, changed, enraged, believing he had been betrayed by the Emperor, Erebus didn't even have to say anything. His work was done. The anathemy had cut more than just skin. It had severed the future, Some fans think the anathema still exists, hidden away, waiting for another soul to take up its curse. Others say it was consumed by the warp, its purpose fulfilled. But I think the most disturbing idea is that it doesn't matter, because the anathema wasn't just a blade. It was an idea that belief in violence, when perfectly aligned, can topple even the gods. And Erebus? He was the one who proved it. The fall of Horus wasn't some sudden explosion. It was a slow unraveling, a deliberate dismantling of a demigod's soul. And at the center of it all, like a spider patiently weaving his web, sat Erebus. A lot of people still think Horus was just tempted by chaos, that he fell because he saw power or felt betrayed or was broken by fate. But the truth is darker. Horus didn't trip into damnation. He was pushed over and over again by a man who knew exactly where to apply pressure. Erebus didn't seduce Horus, he hunted him. It all started with the wound. The anathema didn't just pierce Horus's body, it infected it with a spiritual rot, a sickness that no imperial medicine could touch. As Horus lay in his coma, convulsing and dying, Erebus moved in. The sons of Horus didn't know what else to do. Their beloved Primarch was dying, and Erebus just happened to know of a temple, the Serpent Lodge, where ancient healing rites could be performed. It was subtle. It felt like salvation. But it was the trap closing. During that so-called healing, Erebus didn't just heal Horus's body. He invaded his mind. Using ancient Colchizian rites, demonic influence, and warp-fueled visions, he entered the dreams of the War Master. And that's where the real war began. Not on a battlefield, but in Horus's soul. What Erebus showed him in that state wasn't random. It was a carefully curated campaign of psychological destruction. He showed Horus false futures, twisted lies, images of a galaxy where the Emperor betrayed him, used him, cast him aside the moment his usefulness ended. I still remember the first time I read those scenes. It wasn't just horrifying, it felt personal. Because Erebus didn't just show Horus war and fire, he showed him meaning. That's the most dangerous kind of lie. He made Horus feel like he was the victim, like his entire life had been a cruel manipulation. And in those moments of pain, confusion, and loneliness, Erebus offered something else: truth, clarity, purpose. Not obedience, but revenge. Not service, but ascension. There's this theory that Erebus used a kind of psychic mirroring during those dreams, that he literally took on the form of Horus's closest advisors, his friends, maybe even the Emperor himself, so that the lies felt real. So that when he whispered to Horus, it wasn't Erebus he saw, it was someone he trusted, and that makes it all the more insidious. Horus didn't just fall for the lie, he recognized the voice speaking it. That's how deep the manipulation went, and the warp didn't make things any easier. Once the wound was opened, the demons began their own assault, feeding Horus nightmare after nightmare, until reality itself lost meaning. It wasn't a fever dream, it was a total psychic assault, a bombardment of horrors paired with a single thread of comfort. Erebus, the one constant voice, the guide, the savior. And that's what gets me. Horus didn't just believe him, he clung to him. Erebus had become his anchor in a storm of madness. By the time Horus awoke, the man who had once sworn eternal loyalty to the Emperor was gone. In his place stood something new, still brilliant, still charismatic, but broken inside, reassembled by hands that knew exactly which pieces to leave out. Erebus didn't just manipulate Horus's decisions, he rewrote the way he thought. What once was faith became fury. What once was unity became conquest, and the galaxy would never recover. I've seen fans debate whether Erebus ever regretted it, whether in some hidden moment he looked at what Horus became and wondered if he had gone too far. But I don't think so. Erebus believed in what he was doing. Every lie, every ritual, every act of cruelty was part of a vision he thought was necessary. And that makes him more terrifying than any bloodthirsty warlord. Because he didn't act out of rage or ambition. He acted with belief. In the end, Horus didn't fall. He was pushed, guided, molded, and Erebus, smiling, whispering, invisible to most, was the sculptor, the great deceiver, the first traitor, not in name, but in action, and the galaxy burned for it. Once the Horus heresy was fully underway, you might think Erebus would fade into the background. The galaxy was on fire, the legions were splitting, Primarchs were at each other's throats. Surely now it was about the big players, right? Horus, Lorgar, Fulgrim, Mortarion. But here's the twist. Erebus never stepped back. He just sank deeper into the shadows. And honestly, that's where he was always most dangerous. He wasn't out there leading fleets. He wasn't claiming glory. He was orchestrating the apocalypse from behind the curtain, like a conductor of betrayal whose masterpiece was finally echoing across the stars. Take Istvan, for example, the opening slaughter of the heresy. Everyone remembers the Loyalist legions being massacred by their own brothers, the betrayal that shook the Imperium to its core. But behind all of it, woven into the strategy, was Erebus. He was the one who helped lay the groundwork for that massacre, whispering into the right ears, ensuring the right commands went out at just the right moment. While Horus took the credit, Erebus was one of the few who actually made it happen. And that's his pattern, isn't it? He doesn't need a throne. He needs influence. But it wasn't just battlefields he haunted. Erebus was just as active in the spiritual and psychic war raging beneath the surface. Take Nicaea. A lot of people forget that Erebus was watching the fallout of the Council long before the heresy began. He knew the Imperium's stance on Psykers would leave a fracture, a wound of its own, and he exploited it relentlessly. While the Loyalists were still arguing about librarians and sanctioned witchcraft, Erebus was already knee-deep in demonology, binding warp entities into flesh and stone, carving heretical rites into the bones of planets. He took the word-bearers and pushed them deeper and deeper into religious madness. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were zealots conducting galaxy-spanning rituals. Entire campaigns weren't fought for territory. They were fought to complete rites, to corrupt sacred sites, to turn once loyal bastions of imperial faith into monuments of despair. Every time a world fell, Erebus didn't just destroy it. He defiled it, turned it into a beacon for the dark gods. There's this idea among some fans that Erebus was the real villain of the heresy, not Horus. And honestly, I get it. Horus was tragic. He was powerful, charismatic, yes, but in the end, he was a man who broke under pressure and manipulation. Erebus? He knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't doubt, didn't stumble. Every step he took was calculated. While Horus questioned his own choices in quiet moments, Erebus was already 3 steps ahead, preparing the next betrayal. And don't forget, he wasn't just corrupting space marines. Erebus extended his reach into human cults, planetary governors, rogue psykers, mechanicum fringe sects. He was building a network, one fueled by fear, promises, and arcane knowledge. Some of these groups were loyal to Chaos only because Erebus convinced them it was the only path to survive what was coming. Others followed him because they genuinely believed in his version of truth. That's maybe the most terrifying part. He didn't just infect the galaxy with war, he infected it with meaningful war. War with faith behind it. The mass rituals he led during the heresy were on a scale that's hard to even imagine. Sacrifices of entire populations, sorcerous battles where the veil between reality and the warp was torn apart in real time. On some war fronts, Erebus didn't even send Astartes. He sent cults, summoned demons, performed rites that erased cities from existence without firing a single bolter round. His warfare wasn't tactical, it was transformational. And all the while, he remained almost invisible to most. If you ask the average citizen of the Imperium who the villain of the heresy was, they'll say Horus, maybe Lorgar, maybe Angron. But Erebus? His name rarely makes the headlines, and that's exactly how he wanted it. There's a whole thread I once read that compared Erebus to the concept of a dark mirror, that he didn't want to be remembered as a conqueror. He He wanted to be remembered by no one, because true corruption doesn't announce itself. It hides in the silence between orders, in the whispers between prayers. He was the rot in the heart of the rebellion, the one who knew when to pull back, when to act, and when to let others take the fall. Even among the traitors he was feared. Even among the corrupted, he was loathed. There are stories of word-bearers themselves attempting to kill him during the heresy, seeing him as too dangerous, too unpredictable, too close to the abyss. But he survived. Of course he did. He always does. Because that's what Erebus is. Not just a man, not even a prophet. He's an idea. The idea that faith, twisted just slightly, can justify anything. And during the heresy, he proved it, over and over again. With every ritual, every lie, every soul led into damnation, not by force, but by belief. Erebus should have died. That's what a lot of people think. After the Siege of Terra, after the heresy crumbled into ashes and the traitor legions scattered into the Eye of Terror like broken shadows, there was this hope, maybe not spoken aloud but deeply felt, that he'd finally pay for what he did. That someone somewhere would find him and make him answer for Monarchia, for Calth, for Horus. But Erebus didn't die. He vanished. And in some twisted way, that was always the plan. Unlike many of the traitor leaders who craved battle and infamy, Erebus had no desire to go out in a blaze of glory. He wasn't built for martyrdom. He was a survivor. While others screamed for blood, Erebus was already thinking about what came after. As the walls of Terra were falling and the loyalists rallied for their last stand, Erebus slipped away, not out of cowardice but because he knew the game was far from over. The heresy was only the beginning. The true war, the eternal war, was just starting, and Erebus wanted a front-row seat. In the years that followed, his name became something like a ghost story among the traitor legions. Even in the Eye of Terror, where demons dance through flame and logic is a suggestion, Erebus kept to the shadows. He didn't build empires like Abaddon or establish fiefdoms like the Iron Warriors. He drifted, whispered, infiltrated. There are stories, some half-truth, some warp-drenched myth, that he moved between demon worlds and mortal strongholds, offering guidance to cult leaders, aiding nascent warbands, always watching, always shaping. And it's not just Chaos Space Marines he influenced. That's the scariest part. Erebus understood the long game. While the Imperium kept its eyes on the eye, Erebus went for the soft spots. He helped establish human cults in places too insignificant for the Inquisition to notice, until it was too late. From underhive sects on Hive Primus to fringe planets out near the Halo stars, his doctrine spread like rot under floorboards. Sometimes subtle, sometimes brazen, always precise. There's this one theory that stuck with me ever since I read it. Some fans believe Erebus took steps to separate himself from time, like literally, that he bargained with warp entities to remove his soul from the linear flow of reality, allowing him to reappear whenever and wherever his influence was needed. It sounds insane, I know, but think about it. He's shown up across different time periods, often in different forms, and always with the same goal: to keep the fire of heresy burning, even if it's just a spark. And then there's the Dark Imperium. After the Great Rift split the galaxy and the Cicatrix Maledictum reshaped the very rules of travel and thought, rumors about Erebus began to surface again. Cults that bear his mark, rituals that match his ancient style. Even whispers of a robed figure speaking with the voice of a forgotten prophet, promising salvation through chaos. Some Inquisitors claim to have tracked him. None have come back. A few believe he's taken on a new identity entirely, perhaps even multiple ones. That Erebus no longer exists as a single person, but as a title passed between dark apostles in the word bearers. Like a mantle, like a curse. Others argue he's still himself, aging, perhaps deformed by warp exposure, but very much alive. Living in the cracks of the Imperium Nihilus, manipulating warbands and stirring civil unrest wherever faith can be exploited. I've even read some wild speculation that Erebus is the architect behind some of the newer, lesser-known chaos sects. That the resurgence of certain demonic cults and the coordinated movements of chaos splinter groups aren't random, but orchestrated, his hand guiding them from behind the veil. And honestly, it wouldn't surprise me. That's always been his strength. He doesn't need armies or demonic princes. He just needs belief. Just a little doubt. Just enough to break one more soul. He is the eternal infiltrator, the corrupter of purpose. And if he is still alive, and I truly believe he is, then he's probably watching, even now. Watching the Imperium bleed under the weight of its own contradictions, waiting for the next Primarch to stumble, the next system to fall, the next torch to be passed into trembling hands. He'll be there, smiling, patient, ready to whisper one more lie that sounds just a little too much like the truth. There's something haunting about the idea that Erebus was never punished. No trial, no reckoning, no poetic justice where the villain finally gets what's coming to him. He just kept moving, slipping through the cracks, always a step ahead of death and vengeance. And that lack of closure, that frustrating absence of consequence, might be the most powerful part of his legacy. Because he didn't just survive the heresy, he survived everything. And in a universe like Warhammer, where survival often means compromise or damnation, Erebus somehow managed both without ever letting go of control. Think about it. How many major figures in the heresy ended up dead, insane, or trapped in some demon world nightmare? Horus obliterated. Fulgrim mutated into something barely recognizable. Perturabo twisted by bitterness. Even Lorgar, the one closest to Erebus, disappeared into the warp, supposedly in pursuit of ultimate truth. But Erebus, he's still out there. Maybe not in the spotlight, but always lurking, always there. There's a fan theory I keep coming back to, one that says Erebus intentionally never ascended to demonhood. That he refused the gifts of the gods, not because he didn't earn them. He absolutely did, but because he didn't want to become something he couldn't control. It makes sense when you think about it. Ascension is a form of reward, sure, but it's also a trap. You become something alien, something bound to the nature of the god that exalts you. Fulgrim is forever in the grip of Slaaneş's hunger. Angron is chained to rage itself. But Erebus? He wants to be the master, not the servant. He didn't spread chaos because he worshipped it. He spread it because it was the sharpest blade in the box, because it worked. He used the gods the way he used people, as tools to reshape reality to his vision. And if that meant kneeling sometimes, so be it. But he always got back up. Another thing fans like to speculate on is Erebus's real goal. Was it just to watch the Imperium fall? Was it revenge for Monarchia? A long game to prove that faith was stronger than reason? Personally, I think those are too small. Erebus doesn't think in terms of nations or vengeance. He thinks in epics. I believe he wanted to change the galaxy on a fundamental level, not just to burn it, but to rewrite the meaning of truth itself. That's why he was so obsessed with belief, with doctrine, with shaping how people see. He didn't need to kill the Emperor with a sword. He wanted to kill him in the hearts of his people, and then fill that void with something darker, more malleable. And here's the really messed up part. He kind of succeeded. The Imperium today is built on worship, on blind obedience, on the very things the Emperor tried to eliminate. You walk into a cathedral on Terra, and you'll hear echoes of Lectitio Divinitatis, the book Erebus helped create. The entire cult imperialis was born from the very corruption he nurtured. So even though he's technically a traitor, his vision won. Twisted and broken, yes, but undeniably his. What always blows my mind is that even his enemies learned from him. The Inquisition, the Ecclesiarchy, even certain chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. They've all adopted parts of his playbook: propaganda, psychological warfare, the use of fear and belief to control populations. And sure, they'd never admit it, but that's the irony, isn't it? The galaxy that emerged from the heresy is one Erebus would be perfectly comfortable in, maybe even proud of. That's the real horror of his legacy, not just the bloodshed, but the ideas that survived him. And yet, despite everything he's done, you'll still find people arguing that Erebus was necessary, that in some horrific backwards way he served a purpose. I've read some takes that say without Erebus, the Imperium would have fallen to stagnation, that chaos needed to rise so humanity could evolve, adapt, harden. I don't know how much I believe that, but it says something that people even consider it. That's how deeply his story messes with your perception of right and wrong, because Erebus wasn't a cartoon villain. He wasn't insane or power-mad in the usual way. He was terrifying because he was calculated, because he could look you in the eye, explain exactly why he did what he did, and almost make you believe it was the only logical choice. That's the kind of evil you can't just punch in the face. That's the kind of evil that lingers, years after the war is over, whispering through archives and forgotten temples, waiting for someone else to pick up the thread. In the end, whether Erebus is still alive doesn't even matter. He's part of the structure now, built into the myth, encoded in the rituals, echoing in the sermons of priests who've never even heard his name. He is betrayal personified, the first corruption, the patient zero of spiritual genocide. And he did it all with a smile on his face and a dagger behind his back. So yeah, the next time someone tells you that Horus was the greatest traitor of the heresy, maybe ask them to look a little deeper, to see who whispered first, who planned it all, who lit the match. Because in the end, the most dangerous enemy isn't the one charging at you with a chainsword. It's the one standing behind you, whispering that you're right to fall. One of the most disturbing things about Erebus isn't just what he did during the heresy. It's how deeply he understood the fragility of truth. Most characters in Warhammer 40k are defined by their raw strength, their command of armies, their psychic power, their brutality. But Erebus? He weaponized perception. He didn't just rewrite history. He made people believe in a different version of it. That's his real strength, the part that gets under your skin the longer you think about him. He wasn't just corrupting bodies or institutions. He was corrupting memory. What makes it worse is that he never needed to prove he was right. He only needed people to doubt. That's all. Just a crack in the wall. Just one soldier wondering if the Emperor really deserved his loyalty. Just one priest asking if the gods in the warp were listening more closely than the Emperor ever did. Erebus didn't force belief. He offered it. Wrapped in pain, yes, but also in comfort. In meaning. He knew how to exploit grief, how to step into the void people felt after loss or failure and offer something to cling to. That's why his heresy spread so fast. Because it didn't feel like heresy. It felt like relief. There's a conversation that comes up a lot in fan circles. Could anyone have stopped Erebus? Was there a moment, some crucial turning point, where someone could have seen what he was doing and cut him down before it spiraled? Some say it was Lorgar. If Lorgar had been stronger, more skeptical, less trusting, maybe he wouldn't have let Erebus lead him by the soul. Others say the Emperor is to blame for abandoning his sons emotionally, for failing to see the value of belief before it was too late. But honestly, I think the tragedy is that Erebus was always going to succeed. Not because he was unstoppable, but because the Imperium was built in a way that left it open to him. You create a galaxy where people are expected to die without question, where truth is hidden behind layers of bureaucracy, where the greatest being in existence refuses to let anyone worship him, and then you expect no one to fill that vacuum? Erebus didn't invent the heresy. He just understood the system better than anyone. He saw the holes in the armor, the fractures in the foundation, and he knew exactly where to press. The reason he's such a compelling villain is because you get it. You see how it happened. It's not some cosmic accident. It's deliberate, calculated, and worst of all, it worked. Even when he was exposed, even when people saw the destruction he caused, there was still doubt, still debate. That's his final trick. He makes you question everything. What is truth in a galaxy ruled by dogma and blood? What is heresy when the line between loyalist and traitor is written in shifting ash? Erebus turns the whole narrative inside out, and that's what makes him more dangerous than 1,000 traitor legions combined. Because you can't kill an idea. You can't shoot suspicion. You can't silence that voice in the back of your mind asking, what if he was right? I remember reading one theory, creepy but fascinating, that Erebus's true goal wasn't even the fall of the Imperium. That was just step one. The real plan, according to this fan's interpretation, was to destroy consensus reality, to spread chaos not just as a force of mutation and madness, but as a philosophy, to make the idea of a stable, shared universe impossible. If you think about it, it almost explains his obsession with ritual and narrative. He wanted to shift the galaxy from one unified truth into a billion fragmented contradictory truths, all equally real, all equally useless. A total collapse of meaning itself. And when you look at where the Imperium is now, fractured, blind, worshipping a god who never wanted worship, fighting wars with no memory of why they started, you start to wonder if Erebus didn't win after all. Not with fire or blades, but with ideas. He planted a lie so deep it took root in the bones of the galaxy. And now, it's part of everything. Every shrine, every sermon, every fearful whisper in the dark. That's why people still talk about him. That's why, even now, his name provokes a visceral reaction. It's not just hatred. It's fear. Fear that he's still out there. Fear that he's watching. But also, just a little bit of fear that, somewhere deep down, in ways no one wants to admit, he understood something the rest of us missed. And maybe that's the true horror of Erebus. Not just that he betrayed everyone, but that he saw through everyone. And what he saw was a galaxy begging to be broken. You know, the more I think about Erebus, the more I realize that what truly sets him apart isn't just what he did, but how small he was while doing it. Not small in power, he was a master manipulator, a living wedge in the soul of the Imperium, but small in the sense that he wasn't a Primarch, not a High Lord of Terra, not even a chapter master. He was just a word-bearer, a chaplain, a figure you'd barely notice in the background of a war council, and yet he changed everything. That's terrifying, because it proves that in this universe, sometimes all it takes is one person in the right place with the wrong convictions. There's something so unsettling about that. We like to think the galaxy is shaped by titans, by the emperors and the Horuses, by demigods and demon princes. But Erebus reminds us that it only takes a whisper, a lie at the right time, to send those titans crashing into ruin. He didn't need a legion at his back. He just needed people to listen. That's always been the scariest part of him for me. He was always just believable enough, just charismatic enough to convince even the strongest among them to look the other way, to consider something different. And it's not like he was subtle forever. Once the heresy was rolling, Erebus was doing blood rituals, binding demons, carving runes into the skin of psychers, and chanting the names of gods that most people didn't even know existed. But people still followed him, not because they believed in what he was doing at first, but because he was certain. And in a universe as bleak and chaotic as Warhammer, certainty is a powerful drug. He offered people clarity when nothing made sense. He gave them purpose, even if that purpose was horrific. That's another thing that really messes with you. How much of what Erebus did was wanted by the people he corrupted. We talk a lot about manipulation, about how he deceived Lorgar, twisted Horus, used cults and psychers as pawns. But sometimes I wonder how many of those people were already looking for a reason to break. Erebus didn't invent their doubts. He amplified them, gave them shape. He didn't force belief. He weaponized the kind that was already there. And it's not like the Imperium made it hard for him. In a galaxy where questions are heresy and blind obedience is survival, someone like Erebus fits perfectly into the cracks. He could walk into a shrine world or a fortress monastery and speak with the voice of a prophet, and people would listen, not because they were weak, but because they were hungry. For meaning, for answers, for something to explain the suffering they saw every day. Erebus gave them that, And when they swallowed the lie, they didn't even realize they were choking. I've read some fan discussions that describe Erebus not as a villain, but as a test. That he represents the ultimate challenge to the Imperium's dogma, a man who proved that truth can be flexible, that faith can be stolen, that loyalty can be bent. And if the galaxy couldn't stop him, what chance does it have against what he helped unleash? There's a haunting logic to that view. Because in a way, Erebus didn't destroy the Imperium by himself. He just showed it how easy it was to let itself fall apart. He's also one of the few characters who never truly doubted his path. That's something I've come to both hate and weirdly admire about him. While so many other traitors wrestled with guilt or shame or identity, Erebus never blinked. He believed in what he was doing from the first ritual to the last breath of a dying world. He never flinched. That kind of certainty is chilling. It's not the kind of zeal that burns out. It's the kind that endures, that waits in the shadows until the next opportunity. And in the warp, time doesn't move like it does for us. If he's still alive, and I believe he is, he's just waiting, watching, planning. Sometimes I try to imagine what Erebus thinks when he looks at the galaxy now. The Imperium broken in half. The Emperor entombed. Chaos worship rampant. Whole systems swallowed by madness. Cults in his image still growing, preaching his twisted interpretations of truth. I bet he's satisfied. But more than that, I bet he thinks his work isn't finished. That the heresy wasn't the climax, but just the prologue. And maybe he's right. Maybe the real war was never between Horus and the Emperor. Maybe it's always been between control and belief. Between imposed truth and personal faith. Between order and the whisper that says, what if everything you've ever known is a lie? Erebus didn't just burn the Imperium. He fractured reality. And he did it without ever needing a throne. Erebus is not just a villain. He's not just another traitor. He is the traitor, the benchmark by which all other betrayals in Warhammer's grim, dark future are measured. You can argue about Horus's fall, Lorgar's faith, or even the madness of Angron. But Erebus? He chose treachery with clear eyes and a steady hand. He believed in it, cultivated it, made it into a doctrine. And in doing so, he shattered the galaxy. What makes him so uniquely loathsome is that he didn't betray out of desperation or some tragic flaw. There was no great crisis of faith, no noble dream gone wrong. Erebus was a believer in corruption from the beginning. He saw loyalty as a tool and trust as a weakness to be exploited. His every action was designed not just to win a war, but to unmake the foundation of the Imperium itself. Its unity, its faith, its future. He wasn't satisfied with victory. He wanted to rewrite the entire purpose of the galaxy. Even among the traitor legions, Erebus is hated. Not feared, hated. Think about that for a moment. These are beings who've made pacts with demons, committed atrocities that make Exterminatus look merciful, and even they look at Erebus with disgust. That's how deep his treachery runs. He didn't just turn his back on the Imperium. He stabbed his own brothers, manipulated his own Primarch, sacrificed allies and pawns alike for the sake of a vision only he truly understood. There's a reason his name is spoken with venom, even among the word-bearers. Some believe he went too far, that he crossed lines even Lorgar would have balked at. Others think he was too successful, so much so that chaos itself began to fear what he might do next. It's hard to say what's worse, that he had no limit to his ambition, or that he never cared who got burned along the way. The galaxy, as we know it, divided, blood-soaked, crumbling under the weight of 1,000 civil wars, exists largely because of one man's ambition. It's easy to forget that. To blame the big names, the loud players, the monstrous warlords. But Erebus? He lit the match. One word here, one knife there, one ritual in the right place at the wrong time. That was all it took. He didn't need armies. He needed belief. He needed people to listen. And they did. Emperor, help us. They did. Sometimes I think the worst part isn't that Erebus won. It's that we let him. that no one saw it coming until it was far, far too late. That's what makes him the perfect embodiment of betrayal. He's not just a heretic. He's not just a monster. He's the quiet whisper in the back of the mind, the doubt that slips in through cracks in conviction. He's proof that you don't need overwhelming power to destroy a civilization. You just need the right pressure point and the patience to wait. And even now, even after everything, we still feel his presence. In the chaos cults spreading like wildfire, in the corruption of once loyal institutions, in the lingering echo of his teachings, twisted and regurgitated through 1,000 voices that don't even know whose words they're speaking. Erebus didn't just survive the heresy. He became something larger than the heresy, a myth, a warning, a shadow that never truly left. So the next time you hear about a schism on some backwater shrine world or a preacher who seems just a little too fervent, maybe ask yourself, what if he's still out there? Watching, smiling, whispering. Because that's what Erebus does best. He doesn't kill dreams, he corrupts them. Slowly, completely, and once they fall, he moves on to the next. If you followed this far, through the lies, the blood, and the madness, then you already understand why this story matters. Erebus isn't just a villain from the past. He's a reminder that betrayal is always one voice away. And if you want to keep diving into the darkest corners of Warhammer, if you want more stories of the forgotten horrors behind the legends, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join me next time. Because the galaxy may have forgotten who started the fire, but we haven't. We remember. And we're not done telling the story.